I'm Johannes Bauer. I'm the director of the Quayle Center for Media and Information Policy. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome Phil Napoli, who is a distinguished professor of public policy and the senior associate dean for faculty research at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. In fact, he has a name chair, James R. Shepley, distinguished chair for public policy. Phil, I don't think I need to introduce him to this audience. He has a long and distinguished career researching media regulation, media institutions, media policy. I can still use your initial book on foundations of communications policy as.
So I just got my $87 royalty check for the year.
Oh, excellent! In some of my teaching, it continues to be a foundational text for people working in communications policy. And I'm not going to go through the whole list of books that you published in between. You're very productive, and I remember Steve once said you're fearless in your research, and I think that always that I thought was a really sort of a good compliment for a researcher, right? That's what we need, to be fearless in our argument, in our experimentation, and how we go forward. And the latest book that Phil published at Columbia University Press, titled Social Media and the Public Interest, has actually caused, I think it's fair to say, has caused a stir initially because of, again, the fearlessness of its argumentation. And then it has shifted to some degree, I think, the public policy discussion, which leads me to the last point I would like to make, and that is that Phil is not only an academic researcher, but he's also a public intellectual whose work is recognized and regarded and paid attention to in Congress and in regulatory agencies. So it's a great pleasure for you, for us to have you here today, Phil. And the topic is really timely, right? Because as social media companies have within a short period of time subjected to a lot of criticism, the question arises: what can we learn from the past, if anything, right? I mean, is this all different, or sort of some issues that kind of are reoccurring? And so, Phil, welcome to this group. The plan usually is we go through the talk, and then afterwards we have a Q&A, which makes it a little easier for the online format. But if there's an urgent question, put it in the chat, please, and I will pay attention to it and maybe sort of intervene quickly, but otherwise then please hold the questions until the end. So Phil, the floor is all yours, the virtual floor. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Johannes, and thank you especially for those kind words about the recent book, because I think you must know more people who've read it than I do. I thought you were going to say, basically, no one really has paid much attention to this thing. What I've actually experienced with the book is actually kind of interesting, which is only recently am I getting really asked to talk about it. So it came out in 2019. So I think maybe some of the, you call it fearless, I call them nutty. So that's cool. Some of the nuttier ideas in the book maybe are seeming less nutty now in light of all that we've been through, I think, in the past year or so. So that's sort of been, my take. All right, let me get the slideshow situation going here. Just get out of the way. So yeah, and the work I'm going to talk about today is work that probably in a perfect world would have been part of the book, but the book got done and out the door, and then it's actually sort of has been inspiring for me, at least, some additional research ideas that like I said, probably would have been good to have in the book. But the overall gist of it was a project where I was really trying to explore what lessons, if any, could we draw from our sort of long history of media regulation that could at least, and I'm not saying that necessarily, that we sort of apply wholesale, but could at least inform the conversation about the problems we're facing now. Because I was just under the impression that wasn't happening, that we were all beginning from the assumption, well, these platforms are fundamentally different and they bear no resemblance to, and the situation bears no resemblance to what we've encountered in the past. And so we would start from there. I wanted to at least see whether there are some relevant continuities and precedents that could, inform current conversation. So that was the goal. Here, so the key questions I was dealing with in the book, other aspects of the regulatory frameworks that have been applied to traditional media that might be relevant. Are there lessons that can be drawn from specific policies or policy principles from the traditional media context? And so that goes back to, kind of work I was doing with that old book that Johannes held up. Now, so with that sort of being my orientation, seeing these things that happened in 2020, of course, got my antenna going. I'm like, fairness. It's interesting to see this concept of fairness really percolate up within the context of social media governance. Here was a former President Trump tweet from, I'm going to say this was around May of 2020, when things really started to pick up steam on the platform regulation front. And there are a series of tweets from Trump that all, in one way or another, address this issue of how fairness should be a part of how social media platforms operate. And it not surprisingly led to both calls for and critiques of the fairness doctrine, which, again, many of you are probably familiar with, but I'm going to do a fair bit of history about the fairness doctrine today. Here are examples of just a sampling of some of the pieces that have come out, fairly, recently, dealing with the, relevance of the fairness doctrine to the current moment. And just to put this, and this is as much data as you're going to get in this presentation. sorry, Keith. I know you Michigan State folks and how quantitative you are. But this was where we just, for the heck of it, thought, what does sort of the Twitter sphere look like in terms of mentions of the fairness doctrine over the past couple of years? And so here we've just graphed it out from 2019 to the end of January of 2021. And you can see, and of course, the massive driver of these spikes, one was, first the election, but then the events of January 6th, creating this massive increase in online discussion about the fairness doctrine. Fortunately for me, it had turned out I had written a short piece over the summer about the relevance of the fairness doctrine to social media regulation, and had gotten some support from the Knight Foundation to expand that into a full paper, which is coming out in Policy and Internet, hopefully pretty soon. But anyway, I think the visual there is pretty striking about something that is very much part of our current policy discourse. So when we're talking about today, I'm going to provide some background on the fairness doctrine, talk a bit about its origins, some of the implementation challenges it faced, reasons for its elimination. Also going to discuss, this is an aspect I'm sort of fascinated with, and it's sort of a tangent maybe for a future project, but I'm really fascinated with the ways in which the fairness doctrine has informed not only the current moment, but subsequent media policy deliberations about a wide range of issues, some of which you could argue don't really have, that strong a connection to the fairness doctrine. But then I will discuss its reemergence in the social media context and what lessons I see for social media regulation, for that conversation. And then more broadly about what some thoughts this has led me to in relation to concepts like fairness and balance and diversity that all are intertwined with the fairness doctrine. So let's revisit it for those who are not familiar. People kind of argue over what its actual official point of origin is, but you can go all the way back to the Federal Radio Commission of 1929 when they made this statement as it relates to the Radio Act of 1927, that it required broadcasters to provide ample play for the free and fair competition of opposing views. So in a sort of informal way, we see it articulated quite early on. But most people attribute its formal origins to the FCC in 1949, at which point the FCC required sort of two prongs to the fairness doctrine. The first prong being a requirement that broadcasters provide coverage of controversial issues of public importance. And the second prong be that coverage be fair and balanced. That was the actual language, and we all know that became part and parcel for many years of the Fox News branding, which you may or may not find ironic. Also, and this is a part I want to highlight now because I'm going to circle back to it later, it sort of gets lost in the conversation about how broadcasters were supposed to implement the fairness doctrine on their end. But the requirement extended to all responsible positions, emphasis is mine, on matters of sufficient importance to be afforded radio time, and also to the various positions taken by responsible groups. Those are important, I think, criteria for us to not lose sight of. And needless to say, as many of you are probably aware, the fairness doctrine applied only to broadcast licensees, not to newspapers, cable, et cetera. And that opens up the whole other Pandora's box about the why and the spectrum and scarcity and all those sort of things, which if you really want to look at some of the nutty stuff I've written, I've talked about that as well. Now, this was ultimately found its way, not surprisingly, to the Supreme Court. A little bit of the narrative about it is interesting because of its relevance to what we're dealing with today, I think. So I'll just try to talk about it quickly. Fred J. Cook was a journalist who wrote a piece for The Nation. It's a little blurry there, but wrote a piece called Hate Clubs of the Air, which was an expose of right-wing radio. And one of the programmers mentioned in that was Reverend Billy James Hargis, who took offense at how he was portrayed in the reporting, and so ended up speaking out about that on a radio program and saying some negative things about Fred Cook. At which point, Fred Cook filed a fairness doctrine complaint to be able to respond to those comments, and the station refused to give him airtime, and that's what ultimately took us to the Supreme Court, Red Lion, the famous Red Lion case in 1969. Just want to highlight what a few of the most frequently emphasized points raised in that case. One, which we grapple with to this day, of course, is this notion that differences in the characteristics of new media justify differences in the First Amendment standards applied to them. This is not anything that people that really there's a consensus on by any stretch of the imagination. Another key point they made was that it is the purpose of the First Amendment to preserve an uninhibited marketplace of ideas in which truth will ultimately prevail. Another topic I've written a bit on lately, and examining how those assumptions hold up in the current technological environment. And then probably the most commonly cited, referenced point they make, that the people as a whole retain their interest in free speech by radio and their collective right to have the medium function consistently with the ends and purposes of the First Amendment. Thus, it's the right of the viewers and listeners, not the right of the broadcasters, which is paramount. That is not, needless to say, not sort of, this is always considered sort of an outlier in how the Supreme Court has approached the First Amendment, which again gets intertwined with, of course, the what or at least perceived as the unique characteristics of broadcasting. But the important point here was that we were talking about a unanimous decision to uphold in 1969 the fairness doctrine as constitutional. Now, the other, that being said, putting it into practice has proven quite challenging and problematic throughout the entirety of its history. One key implementation challenge: what constitutes an appropriate balance of opposing viewpoints? That is, if you look at the nuts and bolts of how this was supposed to work, it was about providing an opposing viewpoint with sort of access to the same audience at the same time. The idea being that inherent notion of counter speech and exposure to an opposing viewpoint being essential to an informed citizenry. So, the logistics of making that work were a key challenge over the course of the history of the fairness doctrine. Political manipulation from, both sides of the political spectrum was a key issue. Presidents, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, all, frequent users of the fairness doctrine for a variety of purposes, whether it's to try to correct what they perceived as negative coverage, or even to sort of intimidate print publications. news organizations that, Washington Post, who had broadcast holdings, using fairness doctrine complaints in hopes of leading to license renewal challenges and such, to sort of have broader ripple effects on how media coverage was oriented. So lots of critiques of the fairness doctrine. A hugely important one was this idea of a chilling effect. And this was, and there were some data when the FCC reevaluated the fairness doctrine in the 1980s, some data provided by, testimony from broadcasters, that essentially the burdens of the fairness doctrine tended to incentivize broadcasters to diminish how much coverage they provided of controversial issues. So the idea being, let's not even go there, let's not even cover this story as a way of circumventing the inevitable fairness doctrine challenges that it would likely trigger. Another important critique is that it really did sort of further institutionalize the kind of binary thinking on issues that has been a critique of journalism all the way to this very day, right? Both sidism, this idea that controversial issues of public importance are inherently able to be boiled down to two sides, and that logic, really did sort of become part and parcel of how the fairness doctrine was put into practice. And again, people would argue that it even had ripple effects into the broader sort of journalistic norms beyond the broadcast context. So these are some of of what I'm trying to get at with those critiques. All this leads to the FCC eliminating the fairness doctrine in 1987 as part of a broader deregulatory trend that was happening at the time. Key reasons: one were these chilling effect concerns, but another was that in an environment of much more competition and much more diversity of sources being available, that it wasn't necessary to ensure diversity of viewpoints anymore, the way it was considered potentially necessary at its point of origin in the late 40s. That being, and so again, I think it's probably important to emphasize that the FCC did not eliminate it on the basis of it being unconstitutional, being a violation of anybody's First Amendment rights, but on the basis of it essentially being ineffective policy in terms of achieving what it was intended to achieve. But nonetheless, there have been frequent efforts to introduce it in all of the years since its elimination. And this is the part I'm digging into a fair bit these days because it interests me. This is not a complete list at all, but it's frequently been revisited within the context of sometimes unrelated policy issues, whether we're talking about minority ownership or localism or network neutrality. You see the fairness doctrine become part of the policy discourse in these and other issues, and its typical function is to serve as boogeyman, because the fairness doctrine doesn't have a particularly positive reputation amongst even across the political spectrum. So it's certainly some folks who long for its return, but the majority tend to think it was not an effective way of achieving its goals. So you see it emerge as a point of reference when other policies are trying to be portrayed as significant examples of government overreach into speech rights. So one of the things I was interested in looking at the current moment is getting at the particular moment. Is this resurgence of the fairness doctrine in current policy discourse just another? Is it just rhetoric? Is it efforts to mischaracterize potentially, or to sort of create an association that isn't relevant? So I've briefly to run through just some of the legislation that's been proposed over the past couple of years to see how it connects, or if at all, with this, the principles inherent in the fairness doctrine. The Ending Support for Internet Censorship Act, and again, this is just a sampling, and it's surprisingly, as we all know, this is an area where it's tough to keep up. It's something, a new piece of legislation every few days, it seems like. But this particular act would give the FTC the authority to decide whether individual platforms are eligible for Section 230 immunity on the basis of whether they moderate information by other information content providers in a manner that is biased against a political party, political candidate, or political viewpoint. If anyone needs a Section 230 review, I'm sort of blazing around as if we're all sort of sick to death of hearing about it at this point, but I recognize there might be some folks who could use a review. So, give me a yell out if I should do that. But here, this is kind of interesting because it puts the Federal Trade Commission in this position of essentially determining whether platforms are behaving in a manner that's sufficiently fair and unbiased against various political viewpoints to merit the kind of immunities that Section 230 provides. So Section 230 becomes sort of a carrot that one earns by being politically neutral, so to speak. The limiting Section 230 immunity for Good Samaritans Act. Here, Section 230 immunity is conditional upon whether interactive computer service provider acts in good faith. And the key, here is that good faith is defined in part as fair dealing standards. So we see this notion of fairness emerge. I'm looking at Ben's comment that lots of employment opportunities for lawyers here. Absolutely right. By the same token, a service acting in bad faith is defined in part as engaging in the intentionally selective enforcement of policies of the provider relating to restricting access or availability of material. And as Baron Zoka has said, in other words, political neutrality. And I tend to agree that, again, the language might be a little more ambiguous, but we're again in a position of legislation trying to treat Section 230 immunity as a mechanism for generating the kind of sort of political neutrality that's sort of inherent in how the fairness doctrine, even if it wasn't his intent, but in terms of reality, in terms of how it operated. Lastly, Online Freedom and Viewpoint Diversity Act narrows Section 230 immunity. The key is the phrase "otherwise objectionable" is removed, and so the range of reasons or points of application for Section 230 immunity becomes limited to content that's obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, promoting self-harm, promoting terrorism, or unlawful. And the elimination of that otherwise objectionable terminology is the elimination of a lot of the ambiguity that, for example, has empowers platforms to address misinformation and disinformation, which doesn't necessarily but does not necessarily also meet any of these other criteria that are listed there. And so here, if we look at Lindsey Graham's expression of the motivations behind this piece of legislation, as he said very explicitly, makes it clear, social media companies are routinely censoring content that to many should be considered valid political speech. And this reform proposal addresses the concerns of those who feel like their political views are being unfairly suppressed. So again, if we think about, and that's sort of been the primary sort of narrative over the past year or so of sort of the need for something that resembles the fairness doctrine as a way of counteracting the political biases of the platforms. That's fundamentally how the underlying principles of the fairness doctrine have resurfaced at this particular moment. Okay, and it's important to emphasize that outside the legislative context, many proposals, both from academic researchers, public interest organizations, suggesting some kind of private or voluntary versions of the fairness doctrine. So, when we get beyond policy into broader notions of governance, there's a fair bit of discussion happening in terms of whether this is something platforms should, adopt on their own. There's been some recent research that suggests, I'll circle back to this later, study of Google News suggesting that platforms are already employing fairness doctrine-like principles in how they curate content. So interesting. And again, that's not, this study, I'll circle back to, it was not, they're characterizing Google News' behavior as fairness doctrine-like principles, not me, but I certainly agree with them. is there relevance here for this concept within the context of social media? Obviously, the conversation can very easily end if we say, fairness doctrine-like principles cannot extend beyond broadcasting because they existed there because of the unique characteristics of the spectrum. And we could all say with about 99.9% certainty that would be the case. But nonetheless, I still want to move on and consider, the larger question of whether it would be good policy or not for a few reasons. There are arguments out there that are still receiving some consideration about perhaps treating these platforms as a public utility, or perhaps treating them as a public forum, or as I mentioned, my nuttiest of ideas, which is, what if we were to treat the aggregation of user data that these platforms rely on as a public resource akin to spectrum, and that could trigger a regulatory framework that involves some form of content regulation. So we can't completely write it off, not completely dismissible. But so let's ask the question: is it good policy? One thing we need to do is go back to and reconsider the chilling effect issue. Most analyses are concluding that any scaling back of Section 230 immunity, even if motivated by trying to create more fairness, would likely lead to more rather than less filtering, because Section 230 doesn't is not the First Amendment. We cannot forget about that. And so here's a typical example of these types of analyses. Here, the conclusion is that in their efforts to enhance their freedoms, conservatives could create an internet that restricts them more than ever before. So it could have some unintended consequences there. But you could also make the argument that maybe this is exactly what we want from a public interest standpoint, that we almost want a chilling effect of some form or another to find its way into the realm of social media content moderation. Certainly that's what's interesting about this particular moment, is that even though there's some bipartisan support for modifying or eliminating Section 230, one party really wants the end result to be more content moderation, and the other wants it to be less. Also important, I think, to note, the original chilling effect related to the question of if issues of public importance were being addressed, not the question of how. There's different types of chilling effects, and this is something else I'm hoping to dive into a bit more later on. The data that have been brought to bear, even in the years since the Fairness Doctrine was eliminated, showed its elimination led to the rise of more news and talk formats. So that's about more issues, more coverage, and then and what the broadcasters were saying at the time was that they were avoiding covering certain stories. So how where the chilling effect might fall, or sort of manifest itself in relation to more issues of partisan slant is a sufficiently separate dimension of a chilling effect, I think. Then there's a question of how the media environment has changed. As I mentioned, the Fairness Doctrine's goal was to expose audiences to exposing viewpoints, so that where the unit of the analysis was the individual audience member, the goal is for that individual audience member to be exposed to competing viewpoints. Is that feasible or effective today in this current environment? And I can't emphasize enough that I don't think about this purely just in terms of the ongoing concerns and debates about the magnitude or lack thereof of filter bubbles. But if we think about the environment as a whole and compare it to decades past, we are in an environment of comparatively less nonpartisan journalism. We're in an environment in which overall levels of trust in news organizations are much lower than they once were. And we're also in an environment in which there's far greater political polarization amongst news consumers. And so what I'm questioning here is whether that's an environment that is conducive to a model along the lines of the Fairness Doctrine. That is, an individual news consumer who's consuming more partisan journalism than was once the case, whose level of distrust for news organizations that don't fit within their narrow frame of preference is lower, and in which the degree of the range of the gap, the partisan gap is so much larger. Is that an environment that's conducive to the fairness doctrine having its intended effect? The example I love to use is my colleague Chris Bale. Some of you may know Chris's work. He's run something here at Duke called the Polarization Lab that tries to use tools on social media to generate discussion between folks that will reduce polarization. And for the longest time, his running joke was all the Polarization Lab has been able to do at this point is increase polarization. That's a reflection of these conditions in which he is trying to do what he is trying to do, I think. So all of this raises a larger question of whether counter speech is as effective a policy output, so to speak, as perhaps it once was. Can it achieve what we've often assumed it can do? This leads me to the larger question of how, and perhaps we need to even reprioritize diversity as a policy goal. Traditionally, we pursued diversity of viewpoints as a mechanism for creating an informed citizenry. I'm starting to think, and there's no data underlying this. This is just thought bubble that we might need to think of the relationship between diversity of viewpoints and an informed citizenry in this way, in which we reach a point of diminishing returns. And if you knew, I don't think I sent her the link so I could say this. If you knew what kind of viewpoints my mom was consuming on YouTube, you would start to think, yes, maybe there is a point of diminishing returns here. That you can find extreme viewpoints now that were not accessible before, and that could actually lead to a less informed person. And if, again, hate to use her as an example, but if you saw the health advice my mom was giving me these days, you would understand what I'm getting at. And this takes me back to a colleague of mine. Steve and I both knew Sandra way back when. And Sandra Brayman contributed a chapter to a book we did a number of years back, which I found myself revisiting recently, where she talks about this idea of needing to avoid the fetishization of diversity. And by that, we basically mean, don't pursue it as, above all other goals. Don't simplify it as a goal, and that is, under the basic presumption, more is always better, and don't let it necessarily take precedence over other relevant policy objectives. And so I find myself agreeing with that, in the current moment quite a bit, where we need to think about ways in which, in addition to that, diversity, to some degree instead of, we think about ways to prioritize things like accuracy and trustworthiness and authoritativeness. Again, to me, that's another, inevitable sort of thought byproduct of how we're watching the fairness doctrine, debate revolve in the social media space. Then, again, it also has provoked in me some thoughts about concepts like fairness and balance, and related concepts like false equivalency and gatekeeping. One of the key critiques of journalism these days, and self-critiques, is especially as they're reflecting on the past 4 years, is the fact that, or the concern that in effort to sort of adhere to the traditional journalistic norms of balance and fairness, damaging false equivalencies were essentially perpetuated. And that there, therefore becomes less a path to cultivating an informed citizenry than before. And that goes again to, the reasoning being that as viewpoints get more extreme, the efforts to provide fairness and balance end up contributing to a legitimization of viewpoints that might not otherwise have fallen within what we consider the bounds of legitimate debate. And like I said, this is really, we're gathering, in fact, for another project, all of the journalistic self-evaluation and self-critique that has been published in the wake of the 2020 election. We did something similar in the wake of the 2016 election. Now we're doing this now, and we're very interested in sort of the different kinds of questions that the news media are asking themselves. And this takes me back to the study of Google News, where one of the key findings was as follows. Because there are fewer right-leaning publications than center or left-leaning ones, in order to maintain this fair balance, hyper-partisan far-right news sources of low trust receive more visibility than some news sources that might be more familiar to or trusted by the public. And so these are the what's the word I'm looking for? I can come into later. Almost the imbalances, you could argue, that come from efforts to pursue balance. I think it's important to remember fairness and balance do not mean the same thing. At least my interpretation is there's more passivity inherent in the notion of balance than there is in the notion of fairness. Fairness can and often should lead to a lack of balance. If one can imagine a fair assessment of a situation leading to the conclusion that this perspective does not deserve the same amount of credence as that perspective. That is a role that we should expect our gatekeepers to continue to play. And this is where, this is one of my frustrations as I've watched all these various congressional hearings over the past couple of years. When I watch the platforms, executives go before Congress and get grilled about their, suppression of conservative viewpoints, they never respond by asking, well, what about the possibility that some viewpoints engage in more violations of the objective criteria that we apply in our content curation and moderation policies? That's where we've all watched a bit of conflation of, political viewpoints and factuality happen over the past few years. Raises the question of whether this notion of a balance of opposing viewpoints really is the same kind of valid proxy for a well-functioning marketplace of ideas now than it was in the past. Again, you might argue that it never was. Nor does fairness equal passivity. The Trump White House's executive order actually explicitly argued that these platforms should be passive bulletin boards. They really never have been, and I don't think we want them to be. And this is where it's also important to remember this, perspective from the original articulation of the fairness doctrine, that all responsible positions on matters of sufficient importance should be afforded radio time, and those positions taken by responsible groups. So even if we were to imagine a realm in which, fairness was being pursued, that does not, take away the responsibility for making, ultimately subjective judgments about what are responsible positions, who are responsible groups. So obviously I'm, I'm concerned about any efforts to institutionalize a fairness doctrine-like approach to gatekeeping in the social media context. And this is not to say that I'm not open to, or even you think there might need to be some kind of content-oriented interventions in this space. But I'm just, I come down more on the bad policy side in this analysis. A version of going forward where we don't allow notions of fairness and counter speech and enhancing of diversity of viewpoints to be perhaps the same kind of, dominant driving force that they've traditionally been. I floated this to a guy in my office as a joke. I said, what we need really is an accuracy doctrine, which of course opens all kinds of cans of worms. But I've got this colleague now who's obsessed with, the Napoli accuracy doctrine, and is telling me I need to write that up. But I haven't really embraced my own idea that much at this point. But it's, it's an extreme version of the direction that, I think is more important at this point.